So the Kubernetes components, these are some of the Kubernetes components. First one is a node and pod. Node is a simple server or it's a virtual machine. The smallest unit of Kubernetes is the pod. Pod is an abstraction over the container. Pod creates the runtime environment for the container. So pod gets its own IP address and they are ephemeral, which means that they die very easily because of the when the application crashes. So it gets new IP address assigned every time it gets restarted or it is created when and every time. So if we point out to that particular IP address, then we had to change it every time. So this for this reason we have a service. Service is like a permanent IP address which is attached to the pod. The life cycle of the pod and service are not connected. So the external service is a connection to be open to the external browser so that they can access that particular IP address. We can also create internal services which are only accessible by the internal resources or the services within the within the node. So what about what if I have a host which is a application which is hosted and I have to access that particular application from outside browser. So in that case we use Ingress. Ingress is like a if Ingress is like it maps the domain address to and forwards that particular domain address to the mapped service using the port address. So what is a config map and secret? So we have in usually we store our data like the URLs, passwords, usernames in the config file. So pod communicates with each other using these services. So it has to store the IP address of each other services. And if it is configured in the application property, so every time these services gets changed, we have to change it completely and then redeploy it. So instead of this, if we use this config map inside the Kubernetes, it is like an external configuration file and which will be connected to the pod. So the pod gets the data like URL data, other data. So what if the data contains something very secret like the password? So in that case, we can use something called secret file. It is also created just like the config file, but the data is stored in the form of base 64 encoded value. We can use these values using in our application using the environment variables directly. What about if we have some database applications? What if my pod dies? Then the database updated also dies along with the pod which is attached to it, and so every time all the data is lost. So that's why we have the volumes. They are like the storages on some local machine or a remote machine on the cloud or which is outside of the Kubernetes cluster, and it has an external reference. Now this makes the data to be persistent across the pods. So if one pod dies, the other pod will be able to take the data from where it has left off. So the data is now persistent. Okay, Kubernetes doesn't manage this data. We are responsible for replicating, managing the data, and keep it up to date